Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the podcast Safe and Safe Country, where we will speak about different aspects of security and defense. How does it influence our daily life, and when and how Ukraine will win this war? My name is Alina Frolova, and I am a deputy chairperson of the Center for Defense Strategies. This is independent Ukrainian think tank, and we produce this podcast together with the Ukrainska Pravda, which is one of the biggest online media in Ukraine. So welcome to our second episode, and our honorable guest today is General Wesley Kanne Clark, retired United States Army officer. General graduated as a valedictorian from West Point and the University of Oxford, where he obtained a degree in philosophy, politics, and economics. Has master degree in military science, spent 34 years in the US Army, and received many military decorations, several honorary knighthoods, and the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Clark served as the Supreme Allied Commander Europe of NATO from 1997 to 2000, commanding Operation Allied Force during Kosovo War. General also was considered as a potential candidate for the Democratic nomination in 2004 and 2008. So we have a guest with perfect combination of military and political background who can speak us freely about his evaluation of Ukrainian war. General, welcome, first of all, and thank you for agreeing to make this podcast. Let's start from the news of today. So this Putin appeal to Russian nation with the mobilization, with the new threats of using the nuclear weapons, actually. I was given by myself today like few interviews to different media, foreign media, and all of them were asking whether Ukrainians are afraid of using the nuclear missiles or whatever type of weapons, and they were quite surprised with my answer that we don't, because we clearly understand it won't change the course of war, even the usage of nuclear weapons. What's your opinion about what he said? How serious you take this situation, and what do you think about the nuclear threat?
Well, I think, first of all, that Mr. Putin is losing, and he knows it. He can see the end in sight, both for the mission in Ukraine and for his control in Russia. And so he is increasingly desperate to hang on and to succeed. So holding referenda, fake referenda, in Luhansk and Donetsk and maybe in Kherson is a way of then increasing the credibility of his use of nuclear weapons. It's hard to imagine he would use nuclear weapons in an invasion. But if he can say that Mother Russia is threatened after he's annexed these provinces, then maybe he thinks the world will see this as a more credible threat. He is not using the nuclear weapons yet. We've always known he was capable of doing just about anything, and he could use them. We know from our studies of the battlefield that a few tactical nuclear weapons will not change a battle. Hundreds of them, sure. But the use of nuclear weapons is a shock effect. That's what it's intended to do. And in this case, the threat is intended to shock the Western allies and scare them away from supporting Ukraine.
Did you scare?
This is a time where Ukraine has to be resolute, and so do her friends abroad.
What do you think, if potentially he will use it, for example, from the Mediterranean Sea, will be some launches which will look like a nuclear threat? Will it cause some kind of more active involvement of the Western countries like the US in this operation? And will it mean that they will try to intercept, for example, these missiles, whether it's possible?
Well, I'm not sure that we have the technology to intercept a cannon-launched projectile from some artillery piece that's sitting in Russia within range of Ukraine. So I don't think there's any magic solution to prevent the use of a nuclear weapon. But I think that Mr. Putin has to understand what it means. Here's what it means to the West. If he's allowed to intimidate and succeed in overrunning Ukraine through the threat or use of a nuclear weapon, it opens a completely new chapter, a dark, terrible chapter in modern human history, in which any nuclear armed state will be presuming that it can overrun a neighbor. It means war is more likely between China and Taiwan, between India and Pakistan, between Iran and Saudi Arabia or the Emirates, between North Korea and South Korea. It means the breakdown of the international institutions that we put in place that have largely held the peace since World War II. And knowing what the consequences will be, then the West is going to do everything it can to persuade Mr. Putin not to do this. If he does it once, to persuade him not to do it again. And I hope that we will do everything we can to help Ukraine regain all of its territories, including Crimea, because I think it's very important that aggression not be rewarded.
A few months ago, you signed like a appeal of 20 prominent U.S. Former officers or those who were on official service with appeal to provide the long-range missiles like ATACMS to Ukraine. And this actually was also the appeal of Zaluzhny in his like a statement article which he published before last Ramstein meeting, that this is the part of the strategy which can bring the war on Russian territory and therefore to make Russia to think about continuing this war. So will provision of the long-range missiles in this situation escalate or de-escalate? And whether the Ukrainian, how do you feel whether the Ukrainian government is ready to discuss it and ready to take this decision?
Well, I think, Alina, that this is the time that the United States has to double down on its assistance to Ukraine. Honestly, Mr. Putin has to be convinced he's not going to win by bluff, by threat, or by the actual use of nuclear weapons against Ukraine. It's that simple. This is the future of mankind and global civilization. And unfortunately for the people and soldiers of Ukraine, you're on the front lines of this. But in a way, the whole world is on the front lines of this. Put on that by Mr. Putin. And I believe that in the coming weeks, there'll be an intensification of diplomatic pressure against Russia. You'll see the intensification of the economic embargo. And I think you'll see inside Russia a determined effort to change its leadership.
Well, we'll see. In Ukraine, not so many people believes in internal Russian efforts, probably because we know them quite well. But still, it's interesting. And still, it's interesting from your point of view. You was like a commander of operation in Kosovo, like a representing NATO there. And you was also in nomination for the presidential election, internal democratic nomination in 2008. So you have like a political experience and you have a military experience. And based on these like two experiences of you, how do you evaluate the US policy towards Ukraine during all this period of war? Are you satisfied with this? What you will do in other way? What course you support? What you consider right or wrong in this?
Well, I think that the United States has been quite resolute. We have rallied the European countries. We've held NATO back because we knew that pushing NATO forward as an institution would be an incentive and an enabler for Mr. Putin to rally Russian support. So NATO is not involved in this, nor should it be. But the United States has been very strong behind the lines. And contrary to what Mr. Putin said, the United States has no interest in destroying Russia. None whatsoever. This is not against Russia. This is against Mr. Putin and his unprovoked war of aggression against Ukraine. And that simply can't be permitted. And I think the logic of the American position is powerful. I think it will withstand the challenges of politics in the United States and elsewhere. You know, for 8 years, the nations of the West have put sanctions on Mr. Putin for his illegal seizure of Crimea and the fact that he wanted to incorporate it into Russia. Well, okay. So having done that, we're hardly going to turn around and say, "Oh, okay, since you threaten nuclear weapons, okay, we now know you're serious, so you can have it." That's not going to happen. And Mr. Putin should be under no misunderstanding that it will happen. No Western statesmen are going to say that. They simply can't. Mr. Putin has put himself in a position where he is in digging himself deeper into a position from which he can't escape with his leadership intact. You can't, as a Russian leader, go against the weight of humanity. It's simply not going to work. China doesn't want a nuclear war. India certainly doesn't want a nuclear war. The Middle East doesn't want a nuclear war. And I can tell you that if a nuclear war were to break out, the first losers would be the people in Iran, because Israel would certainly preempt any Iranian effort. So I think everyone understands what the dangers are of what Mr. Putin's threatening, and I think the dangers will serve to mobilize global opinion against him. And I think this, in turn, will lead to his overthrow.
Well, the sanctions probably is quite a big part of the story, but this has a very long term effect. And we are speaking about the immediate threat, and probably this requests some kind of other statements or involvement. For example, one of UK parliamentarians, he said that in case of any nuclear threat, and he was telling not even about the weapons, but about the occupation of the power plant, that in case of nuclear threat to Europe, they will consider this as a story which will activate Article 5, because this is the direct threat to the NATO countries. What do you think about such an approach? Will we see some kind of more active involvement of NATO, and NATO as an alliance in this situation?
Well, I think if he attacks the power plant with the intent of spreading radiation across Europe, that's an attack on Europe, and it'll be viewed exactly as that, depending on the wind patterns. And it's possible that if he strikes the power plant at the wrong time, all that radiation could fall back on Russia. So if I were Mr. Putin, I wouldn't do it. If I were Mr. Putin, I'd be approaching President Modi and President Xi and saying, okay, I've got a strong front here. Now, what's the right way out of this? But maybe he won't do that. In that case, I think we need to have stronger U.S. diplomatic leadership globally to approach these other countries who've been sitting on the sidelines and have them tell Mr. Putin in no uncertain terms, time to stop. Pull back, account for the missing people. It's not about hurting Russia. You must, however, pull out, pay reparations, account for everybody who's missing, and there are going to be war crimes trials. You heard Chancellor Scholz say that at the United Nations yesterday. So this has gone far enough, Mr. Putin. You need to stop it here.
Yeah, would like to, but I have a great doubts about he is thinking rationally in this situation and whatever. But let's step back a little bit to the period before war. For almost 1 year, we had a demonstration of Russia, of Putin, of its potential on the borders with Ukraine. They have been keeping their forces, constantly making some exercises, and everyone was speaking about the war, especially the last months. The US intelligence, UK intelligence, they were telling directly that there would be an invasion, and NATO has the data about the invasion. But at the moment of invasion, no one was ready. I mean that there were no plan, no from US, no from UK, no from NATO. There were no readiness and preparedness of troops, of some weapons which can be delivered. So everyone just accepted it. And what does it mean? That if intelligence had this information, if intelligence services were advising to their politician that the war will be, why there were no plan A, plan B, and why it took so much time to make some kind of first decisions?
Well, I think certain mistakes were made by the West. I think we should have put a no-fly zone over Kyiv in January. but no one seemed to think about it. I think we should have introduced sanctions in January, and then we could have relaxed them. But it's the way democracies work in the West. We don't want to move first, even though there's some advantage to doing so. We want to be clear to ourselves, to our electorates, and to the world that we're not provoking this. We're not provoking it. And it puts a tremendous burden on Ukraine. But that's simply the way that it has unfolded. So in this case, there may be information that some particular weapon systems are being moved to the front. Maybe they have nuclear warheads with them. We don't know that. I certainly don't know that. But then the question would be, if you knew that, should you strike first? And the answer would almost certainly be no. No, because we don't want to cross this nuclear threshold. We don't want Mr. Putin to cross the nuclear threshold. We're going to use diplomacy and use force only as a last resort. But it will be used because the stakes in this case are very clear. Now, in the case of February 24th, as I said, mistakes were made, in my view, and we should have preemptively deployed a no-fly zone over Ukraine after the Russian ambassador and foreign minister said that they were not intending to invade. This would have been the time for the West to then say, okay, well, in that case, we'll put a no-fly zone in just to make everybody comfortable, just so the Ukrainians don't get jumpy and do something wrong. So no one can fly. We could have done that. We didn't. But I don't think there's an easy analogy to the current situation. We know that Russia has nuclear weapons. We don't want Russia to use those nuclear weapons. President Biden warned Mr. Putin 2 days ago not to use the nuclear weapons. He said, don't. That was a warning. He gave it on television in the United States on Sunday. So Mr. Putin is well aware of what the concerns of the world will be. He just doesn't take them seriously. And it's going to take the resolute resistance of Ukraine, plus strengthened diplomacy, military assistance, and global opinion to stop the march toward a nuclear conflict.
Okay, let's come now to Ukraine, to its capabilities, capacities, which we have, and of course our armed forces. And how do you evaluate the counteroffensive which happened? Does it mean some kind of principal change in the course of war? Do you see potential perspective? Because here everyone in Ukraine absolutely sure in that we will win, and this counteroffensive, actually, it's first one from 2014, which we saw. And this is the first experience for Ukrainian army. It happened to be quite successful. But is it tactical win, or this is something which strategically influence on the battlefield?
Well, there's no doubt that the counteroffensive has had a strategic impact. It wasn't just the amount of territory or the amount of weapons that were captured, but it was the fact that it was clear that Russia's armed forces are failing. So that was the strategic message of the counteroffensive. It was a powerful message, but thus far, it hasn't been adequately capitalized on by Western leaders. We should be going to Mr. Putin immediately and saying, back out, you're losing, stop before you lose more. We haven't done that yet, at least not publicly. And you have to use military leverage and diplomacy, and you have to use it effectively. So now that Mr. Putin's raised the stakes with the nuclear threat, then I hope that we will see a much stronger diplomatic outreach. Not to tell Ukraine it can't have its territory, but to tell Mr. Putin he has to give it all up.
Do you see some similarities with Kosovo situation? You was a Supreme Allied Commander in Europe of NATO when the Kosovo happened, and you saw all this war, post-war resolution. So is there any similarity? Is there anything which can be accumulated from the lessons learned from Kosovo experience here in Ukraine?
The lesson's very clear. You must escalate military assistance to Ukraine to escalate the battlefield pressure on Mr. Putin. And at the same time, you must structure a diplomatic outreach that tells him he must leave. The third leg of this is not sanctions, but legal. Mr. Putin needs to be under indictment for war crimes. When we put Mr. Milosevic under indictment for war crimes, that was the end of his campaign.
I see. And how do you see the after-war security configuration in Europe? For now on, what I see personally, this is the increasing and strengthening of the new voices, new democracies in Europe, which were like highly dependent before from the opinion of the old democracies like Germany, France, but now Poland, Baltic countries who feel the direct threat to them, and probably even Finland and Norway and Sweden, who also understand the level of threat. They raise more and more actively voices and try to balance this situation in Europe and try to give more floor for different opinions. But does it mean that we will have like regional alliances more powerful? Does it mean that we will see the Black Sea Alliance, for example, and will it provide more stable situation? How do you see the security situation afterwards?
I think countries respond in accordance with their national character. So some countries have personal great experience with Russia. They're very much aware of what the threat is, and they're taking full measures to prevent it. Countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia. Other countries have not had that recent experience, and they're hanging back, hoping that they won't be directly involved. They're on side, but doing less. And I don't want to name those countries because I hope they'll change. But this is the thing about NATO. It will come together. It will not back away. It has strong United States leadership at the core, and it will rally, and other nations will rally to that leadership as this situation develops in Ukraine. So I think what you're going to see is a hardening of the lines, a strengthening of resolution, a greater unanimity in Western response, more support for Ukraine, and more opposition to Russia, and an increasing recognition that it will never go back to normal with Russia, not so long as Mr. Putin's there.
Well, I would say that it depends not only on Putin, but on many people inside Russia. Therefore, we cannot say that only the reject from power of Putin will change the course of Russia, unfortunately. But still, the NATO, what do you think about NATO? I mean that we didn't see some clear position from NATO as an alliance. They preferred to give the floor for nations and didn't make any statements or moves from their side. This alliance was created to deter the war in Europe and in Euro-Atlantics. They didn't. In a situation where they should have some decisions made, they just make Ramstein or let it be, to avoid some kind of, internal nuances, internal differences, and to change the course. So whether NATO should exist in this configuration, with this approach, whether it showed its effectiveness in this war?
Yes, well, a couple of things. First, you ask about the lessons of the 1990s. This is one of the lessons of the 1990s, is that NATO is slow to be engaged. But once it's engaged, it never relaxes its grip. So NATO's been slow to be engaged here, but if Mr. Putin continues, NATO will step forward. I have no doubt about that. But in the meantime, individual nations, and really NATO is nothing but the collection of the individual nations. I want to explain this because our viewers may not know this, but there are really almost no NATO forces. If you say right now, blow the whistle, all you NATO people, line up, you might get 100,000 people. You get the headquarters, you'll get the rapid reaction force, you might get some air defense units. That's all that's under NATO command. The rest of it's all under national command. All logistics is done nationally in NATO. So right now in the United States, we're spinning up our industrial base. That is to say, we're telling the people, be prepared to produce more. We can supply the guided MLRS projectiles to Ukraine indefinitely now at the current rate of consumption. We're producing several hundred HIMARS launchers per year. So there's that's ongoing. We've increased the production of javelins and of Stinger missiles to first refill U.S. stockpiles, but also now this is a warm production base, so it can provide support onward. Our allies are doing the same thing. So the fact that you don't see NATO involved right now doesn't mean NATO is not being prepared to be involved. And Mr. Putin has to understand this.
Good, but speaking about weapons, yes, so this war happened to be quite conventional. We all been discussing for last period that the war of the future would be hybrid, but it happened to be like extremely conventional, let's say so. At the same time, we perfectly understand that only Russia and possibly China has such kind of like a number of tanks and other weapons. So what would be the future war? Would it be conventional? Would it be like a still cyber? Would it be something else? And how this perception of this war and analysis of this war influence on preparation of the leading nations, for example, like US, for future wars?
One of the interesting things about the conflict so far, Alina, is that it has been marked by a certain degree of deterrence. So it's very possible that Russia has more powerful cyber weapons or attacks on the electricity grid that have been employed. They could have gone after destruction of all of Ukraine's power plants at the beginning. Well, they didn't. Mr. Putin wanted, of course, to just eliminate the leadership in Ukraine and keep all the physical assets for Russia. That's going to change. But there has been a marked reluctance by Mr. Putin to use all of his weapons. That's also the case of the United States and the West. So I think what you're going to see in the future is some very careful calculations by states like China. Ask yourself this: does China really want Russia to be stronger? Why is it that Mr. Putin is so determined to take over Ukraine? Or is it not because ultimately Mr. Putin knows the greatest threat to Russia is certainly not Ukraine, not NATO, but China? And China is under no illusions about Mr. Putin and Russia. China would like cheap Russian oil and gas. They'd like Russian military technology insofar as it's still somewhat better in some areas than China's. And they would like to regain Chinese control over East Asia, all the way to the Arctic Circle. Russia stole this from China 130 years ago, and China will want it back. So from the Chinese perspective, they want to do something to sort of maintain face in the world, but they don't want to do so much that Mr. Putin comes out of it greatly strengthened and ready to confront them. So Mr. Putin has no friends. He has only temporary supporters who are very limited in their support. And I think this will drive the character of future conflict.
Well, do you predict some kind of long-term war, or you believe in shorter period? What is your feeling as the experienced military?
Well, I think that the whole world has looked at the horrible losses of Ukrainian and Russian troops that have been engaged in combat and said, we don't want this to happen. So I think there's going to be increasing diplomatic pressure to shut Russia down and stop this fighting. And I think that has to be accompanied by the determination that Russia has to leave Ukraine. I think that is the critical driving factor in this. In military operations, to be successful, you have to link the military operation to the desired political outcome. For example, the operation in Kherson that's underway right now successfully forestalled this phony referendum that was going to be held. So it had a clear, distinct purpose. As it succeeds, it's going to provide a buffer for the critical port of Odessa. So these are political aims at which the military operations must point. So I think the point that I'm making is the West has not yet effectively leveraged Ukrainian military successes to persuade Mr. Putin to leave, and they should do that.
Lend-Lease. It should start to work now, like in the nearest terms. However, it's a little bit postponed. If I remember right, it should be starting in the beginning of October, right? Is there any reasons for postponement? Is there any fluctuations, or this is just the technical issue?
Well, I think that as all diplomacy, it's a matter of getting the right structure, the right personalities, and then it must reflect battlefield realities. So what's happened east of Kharkiv is a very important driving factor in what will be the next diplomatic outcome. If and when Ukrainian forces occupy the right bank of the Dnieper all the way through to the Black Sea and force the Russians out of Kherson, that is going to be a major factor in diplomacy. If Ukrainian forces can shut off the land bridge to Crimea and then occupy Crimea, of course, that will drive the diplomacy. So it is a balancing between military leverage, diplomatic creativity, and pressure from outside personalities. Alina, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you and give my best wishes to the people and the forces of Ukraine.
Thank you, General, for your participation, and see you soon, hope. Thank you for listening and stay with us. Just to remind you that we are Podcast Safe and Safe Country. My name is Alina Frylova, and you can follow us through the Ukrainska Pravda website or through the main podcast platforms like Google, Apple, and Spotify. We'll hear you soon.